Hey folks, Ed Fallon with you. Welcome back to the Fallon Forum. Continuing to broadcast here from Des Moines, Iowa, the cultural and culinary crossroads of America, in the studios of Lorena, 1260 AM and 96.5 FM. Later in the program, we'll give you an update on the Dakota Access Pipeline, efforts to prevent the corporation that owns that from continuing to expand the oil that's flowing through Iowa. But I'm delighted to welcome Marianne Williamson to the program. Marianne, how are you?
I'm great, thank you. Great to be with you.
So this is a busy time in your life.
Yes, it is.
Not that your life hasn't been filled with busyness for one reason or another.
Well, this takes it to a whole other level.
Yeah, congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah. So let's get right to the chase. What is your core position on your climate plan? What does the core of your climate plan look like?
I think we need nothing short of a World War II mass mobilization. I think that what we have to recognize, you know, it's funny, Ed, I read a book many years ago about nervous breakdowns. And it was talking about two major categories of nervous breakdown. One is what was called a hysterical nervous breakdown, and one was a catatonic nervous breakdown. And the book was about the fact that if somebody's having a hysterical nervous breakdown, it's the same kind of hysterical behavior that they demonstrate when they're under stress, taken to a pathological level. If it's a catatonic breakdown, it's somebody's catatonic type of tendencies with which they display stress taken to a radical level. The book was about the fact that sometimes the people closest to them don't realize that it's at a radical place because it's just them being them.
So it's a rhetorical question, but where are we?
Well, where we are is that we have crossed the line.
Yeah.
We have crossed the line into a point where a level of social collapse, a massive level of social collapse, unseen in the modern era, is, while I won't say inevitable, dangerously likely if we do not fundamentally change course,
right.
Whether it has to do with mass starvation, huge food shortages, whole swaths of possibly continents that are uninhabitable where food cannot be grown. So I believe we need a mass mobilization.
And so calling for a mass mobilization along the scale of the World War II
yes.
Emergency mobilization, it pretty much calls it like it is.
Yes.
And I presume that you would support what some are now calling for, that on your very first day in office you would declare an emergency mobilization.
I don't think that that would be necessary if I do the job of president correctly. You know, declaring an emergency has become almost a gimmick. And I don't think that, you know, we don't need presidents that then, okay, Trump is going to call it an emergency at the border, and then a Democrat comes in and calls it a climate emergency. Unfortunately, our times have become so corrupted that the president calling an emergency at this point, almost no matter who it is, the other party will say, yeah. I'm interested in something much deeper than just whether I write on a piece of paper and sign my name that it's an emergency.
So what would your first action as president be? My
first action is to call together a group of people. Well, first of all, the first action, of course, is you appoint a head of the EPA, who is a world-claess environmental scientist.
Doesn't hate the EPA.
I think the whole country will be arguing with the state of Washington over Jay Inslee. You know, I think, no, we want him. No, we don't want him. No, we want him. I think probably, I said to one of the other Democratic candidates one night, so we all know that if anybody wins that's not Jay Inslee, that we'll all be hoping that he would head of the EPA. We need, obviously, the EPA to be filled with magnets. You become a magnet for world-class environmental science. And we all know what's necessary. We need the carbon sequestration. We need the regenerative agriculture. We need the sequestration. We need the alternative energies and sustainable energy for transportation. We need the animal factory farming to be dealt with. I think that the issue for the next president, and why I feel that I have something to offer here, is the ability to mobilize the hearts of the American people. That is the most necessary thing. Because what we need to remember is that the day after the inauguration, the fossil fuel companies and all obstructive elements will be back full force. And if the president,
they already are.
And if the president is someone who simply posits this within an oppositional context, we will not be able to have that World War II level mobilization. Because during World War II, it was understood who the enemy was, and nobody fought World War II as a Democrat or a Republican. So what we need is a president who can enroll the country in the realization that the enemy is not us. And many of the captains of industry who have in fact been in charge of the greatest entities of industrial scale harm are needed in the effort for industrial scale repair.
Do you think you can recruit them in the cause?
I think that I have the best chance of anyone.
Why is that?
First of all, because I'm not an anti-capitalist. I'm for capitalism with a conscience. And I will give credit where credit is due. During World War II, we could not have won World War II without fossil fuels. There was a time on this planet people didn't know. And I don't think that we have to make wrong everyone who, leading up to this time in our history, made their living on fossil fuel. We have to have some, everybody's got to accommodate emotionally. And I believe also that I understand that the level of navigation that is required here, because we have to not only navigate these very turbulent waters of the times in which we live, but also if you're talking about moving from a dirty economy to a clean economy, you're talking about such a huge shift. And I believe that because of my 35-year career, working very closely with people, I can convey, I'm not saying that other candidates wouldn't care, but I feel that I can convey to people, this is going to be a transition, this is not going to be a loss for you, this is going to be a repurposing of your skill set.
But there will sacrifice will be needed, right? Just as it was in World War II.
There's a difference between the word to renounce and sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
Renounce means you give something up. To renounce means you forego the lower in order to achieve the higher. The truth of the matter is, I see it as renunciation and not sacrifice, because ultimately everybody is going to be better off, even economically. Mm-hmm. Ultimately, everybody is going to be better off. This is a transitional period, and I feel that transitional period, in order for it not to be chaotic, that's really, we have emotional and psychological issues here. If this kind of transition is taken up with someone who does not have a skill set to navigate the psychological energies in this country, there will be such chaos, and the best we can get done will be something which the next time they're in power they will repeal anyway. But the idea of inspiring and motivating the country to see this as a national cause that we're taking up, not only for our children, but as moral leaders of the world, that is what I feel can be done with the right president.
Again, climate change is threatening our very existence right now. There is another existential threat on the horizon. It's not engaged yet, but it has been out there for a long time, and it needs to be talked about and addressed, and that's the threat of nuclear war.
Yes.
How would you address the threat of nuclear war?
Well, it's interesting that you say that. I was, just last night, I posted on my Twitter page a piece of a lecture I gave about the B-21 Raiders. The United States Air Force has ordered 100 B-21 Raiders, which are a $560 million airplane. And each one drops not only conventional bombs, but also nuclear bombs. And I was pointing out in this clip, and people can see this also on my Facebook page or on my Instagram page, I was pointing out that just asking, why do we need 100 airplanes that drop nuclear bombs? Of course, if 5 of those, because we have about 7,000, it's believed we have about 7,000 nukes, and the smallest nuclear bomb on the earth today makes Nagasaki and Hiroshima look like pinpricks. Right. So I pointed out that if you dropped 5 of those, you're talking about the end of civilization as we know it. Mm-hmm. You drop 10 of those, it's probably the end for humanity. So I was pointing out, do you think this has anything to do with our national security? Absolutely not. This has to do with short-term profits for the nuclear industry.
Right. So how do you address that as president?
Well,
everybody's failed so far. Obama took a shot at it maybe, but...
No, I'm sorry. I don't think that's very accurate, actually.
Well, I was being generous.
Yeah, no, I don't think that
he
serves...
He talked about it.
Yeah, I don't think that serves the Democrats for us to be in denial about our own track record. I'm sorry.
I agree.
Really don't.
No, I do agree. Yeah.
I'm a candidate who was not doing that. And I think the American people can smell that. And if we want to get the trust of the American people back the way we need to, on the massive level we need to be far more honest with ourselves about our own track record.
So what do you do?
Well, first of all, how I'm running this campaign. Tulsi Gabbard and I are the only candidates who talk about the military-industrial complex. Mm-hmm. We're the only people talking about this, about what you just said, and about the dominance of that. That's the first thing you do.
Bernie Sanders doesn't talk about it?
Well, Bernie Sanders has certainly taken some wonderful actions. For instance, in the in the effort to stop Trump's participation with Yemen, how we participate, with Saudi Arabia in the war being waged against Yemen, in which tens of thousands have died. He certainly did. On the other hand, let's be honest, everybody has a record here. He also okayed those F-35s in Vermont. So it's, I'm sorry, let's all be really honest these days. So at this point, the issue there, when you ask me what I'm doing, is that there's a way in which a campaign is a form of letting the cat out of the bag. You simply say what's true. And I think that's part of the problem with our political establishment.
Yeah.
People are not talking about what's true.
Mm-hmm.
So that's number one. So number two, here I am talking about nuclear bombs. I'm talking about the fact that when I was young, we had to ban the bomb movement.
Mm-hmm.
We're not even talking about nonproliferation. Mm-hmm. And the very fact that, except for me and Tulsi, it's not even a conversation in the campaign, which so many other things, I believe, should be front and center. So what you do, first of all, you have a campaign where you're laying it down, saying it like it is, doing some radical truth-telling, and treating the voters in America like they're adults rather than children. That's number one. Number two, if people hear my agenda about such things as this and actually vote for me, that means by definition they're ready to go there. Yeah. Now, if they're ready to go there, that also means that it's a very good chance. When people say to me, well, what will happen if you're president and Mitch McConnell is still head of the Senate? Well, it's reasonable to consider that if I became president, there would be such a shift in consciousness that Mitch McConnell might not be. So listen, we have a representative form of government. The president is only one of three co-equal branches, but the American people have a choice. If you want to vote for someone like myself, you better believe that the dominance of the military-industrial complex is an issue for me, and the hundreds of billions of dollars that we spend on our military above and beyond what the military says what they need is an issue. And in addition to that, I want a Department of Peace which gives an equal weight to peace building as to military.
Now, you mentioned Tulsi Gabbard. One distinction you have is that she does have a strong background in foreign policy just by virtue of her service. One problem Obama had was he didn't have a deep foreign policy background, and that was perceived as a liability going into the general election. He compensated for that by selecting Joe Biden, because Joe Biden was seen as having a lot of foreign policy background. So maybe you'll select Biden as a running mate?
I think it's time for us. Yeah, I think it's time for us to get serious and get real here. Very experienced politicians, this whole thing of experience, very experienced politicians took us into Iraq. Very experienced politicians took us into Vietnam. We really need to wake up, get out of our denial. What's lacking is not a certain kind of political experience. What's lacking is moral certitude.
So and again, there's so many different areas of the world right now that are in stress because of conflict, and probably no one is more pronounced than the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. How do you address that?
Well, I think we were all hoping that Netanyahu would be a little further out of the way than he is with these last elections. He's a very unfortunate factor. He's very much like Trump. Trump is part of this sort of coterie of the new authoritarianism, the new breed of neo-dictator, and unfortunately he is part of that. My feeling about Israel and Palestine is that we need, and we would have if I'm president, an equal and equally robust dedication, both to the security needs of Israel, the legitimate security needs of Israel, as well as to the human rights and the economic hopes and opportunities of the Palestinian people. If you occupy a territory, then by international law, that does not give you the right to annex. If Netanyahu even talks about in the ensuing days, which he talked about during the campaign, but you hope he was just doing that to get a bunch of right-wingers to vote for him. If he takes anything with any power behind him in doing so that has to do with the annexation of any part of the West Bank, this will begin, it's reasonable to assume it would begin a third intifada. It will be a terrible, terrible thing. I certainly do not support that. I do not support also in the Golan Heights the idea of occupation, given that there's not a democratic government in Syria to negotiate with. Okay, don't even talk about annexation. And I also do not believe that the blockade of Gaza is a good thing. I would not support it. And and I'm Jewish. I think that my support for Israel is well established, but my support for the United States is well established as well. That doesn't mean that I in any way support the agenda of Donald Trump, and neither do I support the agenda of the right-wingers in Israel.
So the two-state solution has kind of a lot of experts are saying that's not a viable proposal. Is that something that...
A lot of experts say it's not. A lot of experts say it is.
So
To
what
me,
do
it
you
is
think?
it's the only viable proposal. Anything else is the, you know, otherwise, if it's not a two-state solution, then you're talking either about the eradication of a Palestinian state or the eradication of a Jewish state, and I'm for a full and robust existence of each.
I see more and more, criticism of that as an option.
Well, of course you do, because the American left has become very influenced by that view. I lived in, so that's a standard left-wing thing today, but that doesn't mean that I'm enrolled.
Okay, yeah. I just wonder if there's some, every nation has its minorities. Is there any way to envision a united Israel-Palestine in which Palestinians live with equal...
Yeah, well, the issue is that if there's a one-state solution, Palestinians will not ultimately be the minority. So that's why.
And that's of concern to.
Well, that's
to Jews.
Well, I believe that there should be, and there is a reason for a Jewish state. I believe there should be, and there is a reason for a Palestinian state. Like I said, if I'm president, the American commitment to the viability and the rights of both will be given equal weight.
Okay. Another issue that is prominent in the campaign is healthcare.
Yes. With
a lot of folks, some candidates calling for Medicare for all, and others saying we need a public option. And that's as far as they're willing to go. Where do you fit in that spectrum?
I have my politics, and my basic leanings are, I would say, very progressive, very left-wing. And you pointed out the two where my progressive friends often pull their hair out and say, who are you? And one, of course, has to do with, I see Israel and Palestine differently than some, but also on health care. I have not been able, with my own heart and my own gut, to go all the way over to the Bernie Sanders plan. I just can't. I understand the intellectual argument, but I'm out there, I'm in the country. The way I see it, and I think that this is a responsibility of every candidate. Every candidate, and I think the responsible ones do, that if you're running for president, there is a chance you could win. Now,
Nobody thought Donald Trump could.
That's right. And so you are carrying a deep, deep responsibility here. Now, if I become president, I think it's clear that I want fundamental pattern disruption, economically, socially, and politically. I want to be an agent of change, and everything I talk about is real change. My economic issues are real change. Department of Children and Youth, real change. Climate mobilization, real change. Department of Peace, real change. Reparations, real change. And I'm aware that the challenge and the issue is to be an agent of change, but not an agent of chaos. Now, when you and I were talking...
We have that in the White House already.
We absolutely do. And we know how dangerous and how damaging it is. So, this is the issue. When you and I were talking about climate change already, and I mentioned that we will not be able to achieve what we want to achieve if it's only within an oppositional context. And the left does this at this point as much as the right. It's kind of like we're children. Well, they did it first. Doesn't matter. We have to get off that particular wheel of suffering. I look at healthcare the same way. Now, I know that with the Bernie Sanders plan, it is a 4-year transition. So intellectually, I get what's the problem, but emotionally and psychologically, it is a problem for a lot of people. So I feel that we could start with the public option. I have heard people. I understand the argument that private health insurance will just glum up the system. I understand the risk, but the truth of the matter is, unless we just got rid of everything and started over, no suggestion here is perfect. Right. So I have to stay with public option.
Okay, and so again, I understand that argument, but let's take that to a different, to a broader perspective. Your campaign is premised on a kind of a psychological transformation of America, of where folks suddenly understand that we can't be fighting each other, we've got to work together, that there's common ground, and that's contrary to the whole current demeanor, whether it's in politics, sports, economics. It's all confrontational. It's all about winning. It's all about getting ahead. And how do you move? I mean, we're embedded in that demeanor very deeply. How do you move beyond that quickly enough to be able to accomplish the things you want to accomplish?
I don't know how old you are, but I'm old enough that I remember when it wasn't this way. This is an infection that set in the 1980s. I remember there was a man named Ivan Boesky, and he was famous for saying, greed is good. This was ushered in with trickle-down economics. I'm not romanticizing what America was before, but there was a general consensus that we were supposed to treat each other right. Not that we ever got there all the way, but this is an aberrational chapter.
And an extended one.
It's an extended one, but if you look at the whole, on the other hand, if you look at the entire narrative of American history, or history in general, 40 years is just 40 years. We need a season of repair. And that season of repair involves, as Gandhi said, Gandhi and Dr. King, in talking about the philosophy of nonviolence, said that part of the work is self-purification, purification of our own hearts. And I believe, Ed, and my career has shown me this. My father used to say, he was a lawyer, and he used to say, talk to the smartest person on the jury. I believe that part of the corruption of our political system is that it talks to people like we're children, and it only speaks to our self-interest. I find when you talk to people in that place where they're intelligent, no moral or no socioeconomic group in this country has a monopoly on values. No socioeconomic group has a monopoly on intelligence. And I am speaking and plan to speak as president to the nobility in people, to the genuine patriotism in people, that we're not just doing this for ourselves, we're doing this for our great-great-grandchildren. And I believe that this is a pregnant moment, in large part because people have seen what agendas such as the Trump agenda do to our national soul. And I believe that we're ready for what Martin Luther King Jr. called a coalition of conscience. I'm putting my bet on the goodness and the dignity and the decency of the American people.
It's a very powerful message, a very compelling message. And here we are 4 months from the Iowa caucuses, and you're not polling very high. What do you do about that? How do you change that? How do you get people to take it more seriously?
Well, I think people who actually hear me speak take it seriously. People who are allowing the gatekeepers, who have clearly undertaken a campaign of smear. And
are we talking about the DNC or some other gatekeeper?
No, I'm not talking about specifically the DNC. Well, although you don't really, some of these, the mockery campaign, the silliness, she's Crystal Lady, she's wacky, she's whatever.
Right. And who's behind that?
I'm not sure. I have some guesses, but I don't know. But the worst part of it, though, is that it gets picked up and then repeated and repeated. I feel that when people actually hear me, they get that that's not who I am. And they also get, it occurs to them, well, no wonder they wanted to, mock her and make sure that we don't take her seriously. Also, these polls are the equivalent of superdelegates, because they have to do with people who are quote-unquote likely Democratic voters. That means people who have voted in primaries before. Many of the people who are supporting my campaign have not voted in Democratic primaries before. That doesn't mean they're not voters. I mean, if you look at my supporters and you do the data analysis, they vote in the midterms. They vote in the regular elections, but they're not known for being necessarily have voted in Democratic primaries, many independents, etc. So, and I don't have the money to, that some have, who are dropping something like $10 million in Iowa alone. But I feel, and my talking to you here today is an example, I am saying some things which I believe need to be said, and which I believe many people believe need to be said. And Martin Luther King Jr. said, your life begins to end on the day you stop talking about things that matter.
Yes.
So I asked myself when I didn't get into the third debate, should I drop out? And between the guidance of my own heart and my own gut and the counsel of people not only who I respect but who I know are real with me and brutally honest with me, my gut says you go. And as long as I show up places, people are listening. There's an energy of truth-telling, radical truth-telling that I believe this country is ready for. then I'm in. And the DNC, the very fact that we think what the DNC says matters so much is part of the problem in American politics today.
Well, yeah, and then part of the problem is the DNC thinks that it matters, and so they create a set of criteria for debates that are designed to exclude a lot of people. And there's a logic behind that, but there's also, I mean, you mentioned Tulsi Gabbard and you having some very similar views on foreign policy. I think they have the same attitude toward her. You guys are outsiders.
Of course they
You
do.
guys are outsiders. They really don't want those voices.
Right. So when you hear
co-opting the
when you hear
Democratic
all
message.
these people who think of themselves as such free thinkers, so lining up behind those who would purposely marginalize people like Tulsi and myself, not realizing how insidiously they're being influenced. You know, it's interesting to me also, the Republicans, it's so ironic, isn't it? The Republicans normally do not defer to the RNC the way the Democrats so often defer to the DNC. Republicans just look at the RNC and say, yeah, those guys work for us, you know, they're our administrative arm. So I'm a radically American thinker. You know, our Constitution doesn't even mention political parties. You know, George Washington warned us against them. It says that to be qualified to be president, you need to have been born here, 35 or older, and lived here for 14 years.
Well, again, Donald Trump has proven that anybody can be president.
Well, I understand
and
that.
hopefully you can prove on the other side that
Well,
virtue is as powerful
yes,
as vice.
I don't invalidate or diminish the importance of people's concern that we already had someone from outside the system. I don't think, however, the problem is the president's lack of experience. I think it's his lack of ethics, his lack of respect and visceral taste for democracy.
So you've traveled a lot in Iowa now. One quick story about something interesting that you think our audience would be interested in hearing about.
The Meskwaki powwow was particularly touching to me, and also the Native American Forum that occurred. I believe very strongly, just as I want reparations for slavery, I feel that this country, like an individual, cannot have the future we want if we're not willing to clean up the past. And so justice for Native Americans is an extremely important part of my campaign. And I felt when I met people at the forum, as well as people at the Meskwaki powwow, I was very moved, and I am very dedicated if I become president. The issue is not as clear-cut as with slavery. We're talking about treaties that weren't fairly negotiated, treaties that have been broken, return of the Black Hills, the Bakken Pipeline, the missing indigenous and murdered indigenous women. And one little girl, she was 9 years old, and she was at the Meskwaki powwow, and she said to me, "You have to win." It was so touching. And the other thing that I remember, and I'm not trying to pander to you, Ed, but I remember when you had me at a particular forum that you were doing, one of the things I've seen, and you're an example of this, but I've seen it in many areas of the country. I've seen it around environment, but I've also seen it around children. I've also seen it around peace building, and I've seen it here as in every other state. We have the people who know what to do. We have the best practices. We have the ingenuity. What we need is a president who would do what it takes to give people such as yourself in all of these areas the support, the resources, the money, and also enroll the American people in an understanding of how important you are.
Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank
I know
you.
you've got a busy schedule. We really appreciate you taking the time to talk
Thank
with
you.
folks. We've been talking with Marianne Williamson. You can learn more about her campaign. I think it's Marianne2020?
Marianne2020.com.
Yeah, great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll be back in a minute, folks. A short break, and then we're going to give you an update on the Dakota Access Pipeline.